The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shannon Prather, and I'm GIS Inc's Marketing Cultivator. Whether you're one of our customers, regular webinar attendees, an Esri community member, partner, or part of the Panda Consulting Deep Dive Workshop group, welcome. We hope you'll enjoy the next hour and a half with us for today's webinar called Get ArcGIS Enterprise Ready and Maximize Your Deployment. As you can imagine, ArcGIS Enterprise has evolved substantially over the years. We know this rapid changing of technology can leave you frustrated and overwhelmed, and that's why GIS Inc and our friends over at Panda Consulting has put together this workshop to help you maximize your investment in ArcGIS. We're going to cover what is ArcGIS Enterprise, enhancements, best practices for architecting and developing, high availability and disaster recovery, and security. We encourage you to post questions throughout the webinar, respond to the polling questions that will appear on your screen throughout the session, and complete the quick 4-question survey that will appear on your screen at the conclusion of the webinar. We will be sending both a copy of this recorded webinar and the Q&A within a week of the broadcast. Now, I mentioned the Panda Consulting Workshop Group earlier, but I'd like to take a moment just to highlight our partnership with this team. Panda Consulting and GIS Inc have worked together in the Azure community since 2016 to form what we call the Land Record Modernization. Panda provides years of land records expertise, while GIS Inc provides expertise with WebGIS. You can learn more on the one-page overview located in the resource center of this webinar. Panda Consulting is led by Frank Conkling. Frank is on the line today and ready to answer any questions you have, and you can submit that in the question panel. Hey, Frank.
Hey, thank you. Just, Shannon, I want to thank everybody from the traditional Panda Consulting workshops who participated. It is a great opportunity for us to pull these two organizations together. So thank you. I'll be quiet.
Thanks, Frank. So you may have heard in the news, but GIS Inc has been acquired by Continental Mapping Consultants. GIS Inc is now a Continental Mapping company. So what does that mean? If you're a customer of ours, you can expect to work with the same great people. We remain an Esri Platinum partner and CityWorks Platinum implementation partner. Now, though, if you need assistance in the areas of geospatial data collection, production, and analysis, our new teammates at Continental Mapping Consultants can help. For more information, you can also check out the one-page overview of our combined capabilities, GIS Inc, Continental Mapping Consultings, and GSG in the Resource Center on the right-hand side of your panel. Now, without further delay, I'm excited to welcome our presenters, Steve Mulberry, our Geospatial Innovation Strategist, and Kelly Bigley, a Senior Geospatial Developer. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. Now, Steve, are you ready to get this audience ready?
Yes, I am, and I'm excited to be here. I'm glad that Kelly Bigley is able to join me today. So, as Shannon mentioned, throughout the presentation here, please submit some questions. We'll try to answer those along the way, but we will have a section towards the end that we can focus in on those, and Kelly's going to help me dive into those. So we got a lot to talk about, so let's get started. If you've heard or seen Jack Dangerman do a presentation this year, you've probably seen this slide. I borrowed it from his presentation stack there, and there's one thing I want to point out here as we get started talking about ArcGIS holistically here, is that obviously, as Shannon's mentioned, the evolution of ArcGIS has doubled and tripled over the time, and the capabilities and functionality and the things that we can do with it is just amazing. And yes, it can be a little overwhelming to kind of figure out how to best leverage the software and the products and the solutions that come with that, how to deploy it, how to secure it, how to make it available to all users. So we're going to take some time and go through that. But I think what I want to point out from this slide here is that it is a vision that Esri has for ArcGIS holistically. You can see that there's different patterns of use with ArcGIS, but down in the lower right-hand corner, you notice those 3 little words down there: software as a service, and platform as a service. And I think that's what Jack was trying to relay in his vision of ArcGIS. ArcGIS has always been around, but there's different elements of that. I think it's important to that we use the next hour and a half to kind of walk through that, right? Talk about, what is this thing, ArcGIS Enterprise? What are some of the enhancements that we're going to talk about in the current release? best practices for architecting and deploying and some of their patterns. What does it mean to be high availability and have disaster recovery? And then obviously security, how to handle security and best practices within this space here. And again, we're going to have a section for questions, but please ask them along the way, and we'll get to those as needed. So let's get started here. So Jack made it very clear that moving forward, it's going to be referred to as ArcGIS holistically, because there are some very key components that fall underneath this family of products, like ArcGIS Online, ArcGIS Enterprise, ArcGIS Desktop, ArcGIS Platform, right? We used to, for many years, we used to all just refer to this thing as the ArcGIS Platform, but we can't do that anymore because there's an actual development environment that's called Platform as a Service, or the ArcGIS Platform. So let's kind of put that in context, and let's focus on ArcGIS Enterprise. But I do want to mention that there's two options for accomplishing web GIS within the ArcGIS ecosystem or system, right? That's ArcGIS Online or ArcGIS Enterprise. And the core capabilities and functionality are the same across the board, whether you're deploying applications, you're creating some visualization tools, you're leveraging the smart mapping, the analysis, the item management, the user control. All that is the exact same across the board, whether you're online or on premise. The difference is that online is a software as a service, right? Where Azure is responsible for doing the upgrades. They control the service level agreement. They control and maintain a level of cloud security alliance, which is really important. And there's actually some links that we'll provide to you that can give you some more information about that. Versus ArcGIS Enterprise, which you then are responsible for upgrading that as needed when you need to upgrade to the next release in the versions. You control the SLA and you control the security. You have that responsibility, and we'll talk about those things specifically as we get there. So let's get started. And I take a different approach when I start talking about ArcGIS Enterprise and what this thing is. And I always start off at the data, because data is always, I think, to me, the most important aspect of any GIS, right? Any geographic information system, and the data that supports that. And so from an ArcGIS Enterprise perspective, the first layer here is the data. And ArcGIS Enterprise gives us the ability to web enable that information. You may have heard of a term called feature services or map services. That's this process of taking that spatially enabled data that sits inside of our enterprise geodatabases and web enabling that. That's sort of the first activity that needs to take place there. The next thing is that we take that information and then we map enable that, right? We create these web maps that allow us to set up our symbology, define our attributes, so what queries we want, any filters like that, sort of how we are going to represent that information that we web enable. And then the next tier, the next level is creating these web applications. And Esri over the years has released hundreds of solutions and templates and out-of-the-box tools that we can web enable these applications with, defining what functionality is available, using things like Web App Builder or Experience Builder, what buttons are available, what branding that I want to apply to those things. But you can kind of see sort of the evolution that we start with web enabling the data, creating this visualization through maps, and then assigning that or applying that to an application or a solution, and then sharing that out to the organization through a secure mechanism. So ArcGIS Enterprise gives us the ability to manage our users and our groups and who has access to what applications and what web maps and what data elements are associated with that. So it's this all-encompassing system that allows me to web enable everything, right? From the data to the maps to the applications, and securely share that throughout my organization. And as a business partner, like GIS Inc and Panda are, where we get added benefit is that Esri also provides a level or layer of access through APIs and SDKs all the way down the chain here, whether I need to enhance or extend the web applications or the maps itself or the data itself, I can have access to that as a developer through the open APIs and SDKs, which makes it really nice to extend the capabilities there. So this is sort of how I explain enterprise holistically. Some of you may have seen this kind of graphic that is available. Esri provides a architecting the ArcGIS platform, or I can't say platform anymore, ArcGIS Enterprise moving forward, and they use this graphic to kind of indicate the deployment patterns through production and staging and development. But you can kind of see those tiers that I just talked about there, with the infrastructure, the portal, the managing the items, the applications that are associated with that, and then extending that out to either within the enterprise or through other business systems themselves. So to kind of connect the dots here and kind of have this final slide here for the enterprise, if we kind of look at the components then of enterprise that I'm managing and working with geodatabases, whether that's in an enterprise geodatabase or a file geodatabase, I'm using ArcGIS Pro to interact and engineer that information and publish that data out to ArcGIS Enterprise, which then allows me to expose these solutions and templates to my users, and or coordinate and communicate with other outside services like ArcGIS Online or other open services out there that I need to ingest and incorporate inside of my use of ArcGIS Enterprise. So I kind of, yeah.
I love these two different illustrations showing the overview of ArcGIS Enterprise. Can you correlate more specifically those rings on the previous slide to the elements on this slide? So which part is that central ring where we're talking about the web-enabled data section?
Yes, so that inner ring picks up right there at that data storage inside the infrastructure tier, right? That's your enterprise geodatabase. That's where you web-enable your information. That's where you manage your spatial components, and then you build out from there, right? The infrastructure gives me the ability to create these maps. Portal gives me the ability to associate those maps with applications, and then just go on from there. So that's,
the portal is like our central ring, or our middle ring, or the web map ring, and then we have the apps in that outer web application ring.
Exactly. Yep. Cool. So with that, Kelly, why don't you take us through our first polling question?
Absolutely. So our first polling question: do you currently use ArcGIS Enterprise? Yes, no? Are you thinking about it? Or are you needing some help seeing whether or not it's right for you? So it's interesting as we see these responses come in.
Yeah,
if you've already answered and you happen to have any other questions that you want to chime in, please feel free to add a question into the question panel. Steve, are you surprised at seeing the responses as they're coming in?
Well, I'm actually not seeing those yet, so you're the only one privy to that.
Okay, so. Well, sweet. Well, we got a couple more. We'll give it a couple more seconds and.
Yeah, let's go ahead and lock that out.
Close it.
See what we got. Okay.
All right.
So it looks like we got a good number of folks that are using it now, some that aren't, and some other responses there. So great. So thank you for taking that poll. That's going to help us as we go through the rest of this discussion and how we may focus in on some other things there. So thank you for that, and let's move on. Can you put me back into the presentation there, Kelly?
Yep, there you go.
Okay, so I mentioned how Jack and Esri as a whole is sort of changing the way they say, and they mentioned ArcGIS holistically, but they're also making an adjustment to how ArcGIS is released, right? And now they're referring to it as for the year of that release cycle. So right now we're in 2021, so now we're talking about ArcGIS 2021. So what happens this year? Right? We're going to see a new ArcGIS Online update literally in a few days from now. We're going to see another update later on in the year. We saw the release of ArcGIS Field Maps early at the beginning of the year. We're going to see ArcGIS Enterprise 10.9.0 is planned also around the same time this week, next week online. We'll see another release, that one later in the year. We'll see Pro, a couple of releases of Pro coming out. So this constitutes ArcGIS now. ArcGIS 2021 looks like this. And that's how Esri is going to kind of move forward with how they They talk about the release cycle, the products that are associated with that year. And I do want to highlight one thing that's coming out here in the beginning of April, and that's this new thing called Esri Design System. And the reason I'm bringing it up because it could have a direct impact on how you extend the capabilities of your solutions that you deploy inside of ArcGIS Enterprise. So we'll talk about that here in a second, but I want to start off with talking about these .0 and .1 releases. What do they really mean? So think of a .0 release as a short-term support release. So 3 years of total support, 1.5 years of patches. And then the long-term or the .1 release gives us a little more support, right? 6 years of support, 4 years of patches and security and things like that. So remember, when you see a .0 or .1, that's what that means. So what is this Esri Design System? I'm going to have Kelly kind of walk us through that real quickly here.
Absolutely. So the Esri Design System, like many other design systems that are out there, is a library of building blocks for creating a user interface. So this is not the map elements at all. This is everything else in your web application. This includes the layout of your elements, navigation between elements, buttons, inputs, icons, the way you style them, color them. And it enables easily creating themes, and it enables a very consistent and streamlined approach to implementing a user interface. And it can be incorporated into any web application, not even one with a map. So this system is actually called Calcite. It's been on GitHub for a while, and Esri has been utilizing it in their solutions. So there's a number of solutions that Esri has already been incorporating, which is the new beta web map viewer. It has been incorporating these new elements. ArcGIS Monitor utilizes these elements, as well as ArcGIS Velocity. And this is just 3 examples, but there are many, many more that you'll see that Esri is utilizing their own design system. And what they're actually doing is now releasing it on the developer's website so that it's not just accessible on GitHub like it used to be. Now it's going to be incorporated into the full developer experience on developers.arcgis.com.
Perfect. Thank you, Kelly. Yes, look for that new release coming out here in just a week or so. All right, so let's move on. And I see some questions coming in. We're going to address some of those here towards the end, but yeah, and I think some of those will be answered here in the next couple of slides. We'll see how that kind of plays out. So let's talk about some enhancements and capabilities that are available right now in the current version, which is 10.8.1. And I'm going to go through some of these topics right here. The first one is administration. A couple of things that you may not know about or may want to take advantage of is the ability to configure this information banner across all your tabs inside of the enterprise portal. So as you're working that, and maybe you can use these banners to maybe notify users of system downtime. Maybe you have different deployment patterns. Maybe you have a classification level or production versus stage versus dev. That banner could illustrate that. Maybe you're going to alert, hey, we're about to do some upgrades. That banner can be used there. You can control the branding of that and how that kind of displays. Another thing you can do is set up the status window. So this status window is something that the end user has to interact with before they even enter into your portal. And maybe this could be privacy statements or terms of use or disclaimer, or those kinds of things that are enforced on me as a user before I even get into the environment there. Read only. Now there's a nice interface now through the portal administration page where you can turn ArcGIS Enterprise into read only. Basically what that means is to freeze it while you might be doing some maintenance work on it, some patches, some upgrades, backups, whatever you're doing, you can freeze it so that the end users can still use the site, but they can't make changes or additions or data updates and things like that, which is important if you're trying to do some backups or updates or patching and things like that. So look at that as an option for that process for managing and administrating this site there. Webhooks is also, so webhooks has been around since I think 10.7.0, but it's been improved on and more open for administering the site, for keeping track of things like when new users are added, or items have changed, or permission has changed, or groups, people are moving in and out of groups. You can use webhooks to push these notifications against these activities and events to you as an administrator, so you can kind of keep track of what's happening there. Now, and webhooks takes on a bigger discussion, which could be another whole webinar into itself. But Kelly, where else could we use webhooks to beyond just the administration side?
Yes. So to me, this is where it gets really exciting. You can configure webhooks for the event of feature layer updates to include features being created, features being updated or deleted. And if this event is something that you're interested in, let's say you configure a webhook to maybe communicate with Power Automate to send an email when a new feature is created. Now you can have a Survey 123 application. The user has submitted their survey, and since it's all been configured with these webhooks, someone else in your organization could receive an email with the contents of the information perhaps filled out in that survey.
Right, or maybe even trigger, like maybe you're doing a survey to I want to sign up to have a bulk item pickup for trash. I could have that email sent and an item in my Outlook calendar automatically generated, because webhooks gives us that ability to communicate between systems, which is really nice. Right. So look for that. If you're an administrator of ArcGIS Enterprise, webhooks can and will be one of your best friends there. Okay. Now this I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this new capability, hosted map image layer, that's a mouthful there, but it's using technology that we should be familiar with. So we're already used to, those of you that have been using ArcGIS Server and Enterprise for some time, should be familiar with the map services, right? These are things that ArcGIS Server created for us. It was server-side rendering, and we access local information managed inside of our Enterprise geodatabase or file geodatabase. And we were able to publish these map services. Portal came along and introduced this hosted feature service layer concept, which the data gets published in to the server, right, inside the data store, and then the rendering is done on the client side. So within the JavaScript applications and things like that, the rendering is done on the client side. So what Esri's done is taking the best of these both worlds, map service and hosted feature, and came up with a hosted map image layer. So if you need to have fast server-side rendering of your maps, because maybe you're doing advanced symbology or something like that, this is going to be your best friend, because you can still have that complex symbology, or that advanced way of rendering things. You can render that on the server side, but the information can still be hosted inside the data store and then pushed out over to your client. So think of this this technology if you need to have that fast server-side rendering with advanced and complex symbology. The key here is that the data needs to be hosted as a feature layer, and the publishing is done through Pro. Now you'll notice that I will mention, if I talk about ArcGIS Desktop, I'm talking about ArcGIS Pro, and this is the only time I'm going to say ArcMap. That's it right there. But I will say that ArcMap is supported. That's one of the questions that came up. ArcMap is going to be supported through 2026. We all know that it's going to be supported. Azure's not going away with that. But Pro is where you want to be at managing your information going forward. There's lots of improvements, enhancements with that. All right, moving on. Vector tile layers. So there's some new improvements with how we manage and work directly with vector tiles. There's going to be an application as part of the new web map interface, allows you to customize the styles, the colors, the fonts, labels, all the icons, the patterns, everything you need to do to meet your specifications for this vector tile service. You now have this really nice interface to do that right inside of Portal. You also have tools for previewing that, setting up alerts, right? When these vector tile services change, or if you're replacing them, they don't match. There's ways to managing this whole concept. So look for some new tools for managing that. This is a big item here, this shared instances. So again, if you've been using the ArcGIS server for some time now, you're familiar with this term called ArcGIS SOC, or SOC processes. Every time you create a map service, there's a process that has to get spun up that requires some memory and some CPU to service that instance. Now you have the ability to either assign a dedicated instance for that map, or you can share instances. So you can piggyback off of the same SOC process and have several maps being published out of that, again, based on the need in the workflow. Sometimes you need to have dedicated, and sometimes you can get away with sharing. And sharing is going to drastically improve the memory performance and usage within inside of your environment there. So look for that. I think even at 9.0, it's going to be by default, it's going to be always set to share instances, and you'll have to override that if you need to. All right, offline maps. If you use offline maps, you'll kind of remember that in order to get that offline map and data down, you usually built this at the extent of your view, or you create this grid kind of pattern, and that's all you had to work with. And sometimes you gathered more information than you needed. Well, now you have the ability to actually define with irregular shaped polygons the exact area that you want to take offline, and have that saved, have that scheduled to have updates for your offline maps, and have a more concise area for dealing with that. Also, sites. So if you're not familiar with sites, ArcGIS Enterprise gives you the ability to create independent and custom sites for maybe your departments, maybe your projects, maybe your different user types, right? Those that you want to kind of isolate into their own space. You can brand them how you want to. Well, now starting at the 10.8x world, this becomes a little bit easier for you, right? You can clone, you can create a template and then clone that out so you can keep the same branding styles and logos and colors and things like that, and manage that concept. And then lastly, user type extensions. It was introduced at 10.8.0. What this means is that Esri now is providing a way to extend what users can do by providing access to very specific functionality within compatible applications. That's a mouthful there, but basically there's two offerings of this right now: the utility network service, user type extension, and the parcel fabric service, right? Which is what we're a lot of the folks here today are interested in. How do I manage and work with my parcel fabric data? Well, at 10.8.0, this is starting to become a services-oriented architecture, meaning that you access these new services through REST endpoints. And so Esri is providing these extensions to help control access to those services and give them to who you need to have as part of the experience there. So lots of neat enhancements and capabilities of the current release of Enterprise, and this year is going to even provide more of that. So Kelly, let's go to our next polling question.
Awesome. So what version of ArcGIS Enterprise do you use? 10.8.1, 10.7.1, 10.6.1, 10.5.1, or you already told us that you don't have it?
I remember, Kelly, it was, wow, 3-4 years ago that we did a Are You Ready for 10.5.1 when it first came out. It's amazing how far we've come. Few short years here. So
yep, so lots of good questions coming in. Keep them coming. I am responding to some of those as I can, and otherwise we'll try to squeeze in throughout the session. Otherwise we'll catch them.
I'm seeing these questions come in. Those are awesome. Yeah, great questions. Great questions, and we'll get to all of them here.
All right, so last chance. Anybody else have a response they want to add into the poll? All right, I'm going to close it.
All right, what do we got here? 10.8.1, good. I'm glad to see that a lot of folks are out there on 10.8.1, but we do, as expected, a variety of folks across, and some of that may be because of the requirements that you have, the other third-party applications that are using these platforms and these environments, and that's totally good. And yes, I like the last one there. Hey, I already told you I didn't have that play. So
that's actually great to see that there's that many attendees that are still ready to look at it, right?
Yes, and I like so I'm gonna pull out one question because I see Michael Bishop's asking some questions here. I think he makes a good point here, is that you can have multiple versions and different deployment patterns. We're going to talk about that. So maybe your production is what's stable and what's going to fulfill your needs. And you might have a staging and dev and others that you can experiment with. You can upgrade as needed. You can check out the new capabilities. So great point there, Michael. All right, so let's move into the architecting and deployment section of ArcGIS Enterprise and what this really means. So in order to do that, I want to start from scratch. I know this might be kind of boring for some of you, but I want to make sure we're all level set here. And the four main components that we're talking about when we talk about ArcGIS Enterprise is the web adapters, the web adapters that support portal and server. Then we have the actual portal for ArcGIS. We have ArcGIS server, and we have the data store, which can constitute storing relational and/or tile-based information. So these are the four main components when you purchase or deploy ArcGIS Enterprise. And there's several ways of architecting and deploying this environment. Beyond that, Esri provides additional server roles based on the need that you have within your organization. You can see some of the ones out there like GeoVent's a real popular one, image server geoanalytics. There's a new one out there called Mission Server. And this is where Esri will extend the capabilities and functionality as they move forward by offering new server roles, okay? So when we're architecting and deploying, there's some best practices, but I want to make sure that there's options. So I'm about to show you one example, but there's options here. So typically when we start to set up, we kind of look at the web adapter and portal, and they can probably sit on server one. We like to isolate ArcGIS server, and we like to isolate the data store. Now, with that said, we know that ArcGIS Enterprise has evolved over the years to become very proficient and efficient at doing its job. And so depending on the size of your organization and the number of users, this literally could sit on one box, right? So it's up to you to kind of work through that capacity planning discussion. If you need help, we can help you do that to determine what's best for your organization. But as a whole, this is sort of the best practice. And then if you need to use one of these additional server roles, and I'm going to pick on GeoVent because that's one of the more popular ones out there, then that should reside on its own server. And in this case, GeoVent requires a spatial temporal big data store, so that might require another server. So here's an example of how you might deploy ArcGIS Enterprise with GeoVent and the spatial temporal big data store. Okay, now from that, we still have the option of putting this stuff on premise or in the cloud. Okay, either or. Okay, and now and we know that when we deploy this, a key component of this is desktop. Desktop becomes a key component for managing, for publishing. It's integral into this ArcGIS Enterprise deployment and architecting. So you got to make sure you don't forget that. And traditionally, ArcGIS Desktop talks to, and I'm talking about Pro here, talks to your enterprise geodatabase, which sits inside one of those supported relational database management systems. Again, that can be on-premise and or in the cloud. Now, I'm going to pause here for a second because I want to make a very clear point here, is that typically when you're deploying ArcGIS Enterprise, you don't ever separate out the client from the data. The client in this case could be the web adapter, portal, and server are the client, and the data store is the data. ArcGIS Desktop is the client, and the Enterprise Geodatabase is the data. GeoVent is the client, and the Spatial Temporal Data Store is the data. Don't ever separate them. Try to avoid this deployment practice at all costs. There's some reasoning behind that, okay? Because you want to have that client and the data on the same backbone so you can obtain the best proficiency of serving out that information. Now, I say that, but there are 3 exceptions to this rule. There's 3 exceptions that you might want to separate out some data from the client. The first exception, so maybe I have ArcGIS Enterprise on-prem, and I'm using cached map services. I'm building that tile-based service. So when someone comes to my site, I can actually store that cached map data, those tiles, those files out on, say, an Amazon S3 bucket. Okay, so when someone comes into the portal, they access the application. The portal answers the application and says, hey, all these tile map services are actually sitting out on Amazon 3. Go get them from there instead of bogging down my environment. Okay, so that's one example. The other example is maybe you're using image server role. And the same concept is that maybe you're collecting information from drone or satellite or or aerial photography, that information can also, that data can also sit in Amazon or another cloud storage provider, and you can keep your enterprise deployment on premise and keep that information out in the cloud. That works just nicely too. The third exception is Pro. Now I just shouted from the soapbox, so never separate desktop from the data, but in the case where you're using desktop and ArcGIS Pro to access REST endpoints, things like your feature services or your tile map services, customer map services like I just talked about, or accessing these new service-oriented architecture technology like the utility network service or the parcel fabric service. And I imagine, again, this is totally my opinion here. I didn't get this from anybody out there, but I anticipate that Azure is going to move more towards this accessing feature services instead of directly connecting to the database over time. Now, it could be true, wrong or right there, but that's my opinion here, and we're seeing a lot of folks take advantage of this now. So this is one area where you could separate out Pro from Enterprise and have one on-prem and one in the cloud, but if you still need to access this directly, I would recommend those two components being on the same backbone so you can have a nice, clean, and fast connection to your geodatabases.
Steve, let me interrupt you for a minute, right? Because I'm so glad you mentioned this, because this is actually an implementation strategy that we're starting to see more and more with the parcel fabric, that rather than going and grouping the parcel fabric server with everything else, we're finding either putting it up on some sort of enterprise cloud and using REST endpoints, or segregating into another server. So it's not all or nothing. There's a lot of variations on how you can do that. Thank you for going and introducing this. I'll be quiet.
Yep.
Good point, Seth.
No problem,
So I'm
Frank.
going to interrupt and ask one question too. What about ArcGIS Pro in the cloud? Is that an option?
So is ArcGIS Pro an option in the cloud? And we have this discussion a lot of times when we start talking with our customers about migrating to the cloud. Don't ever forget to have this discussion about Pro. Where does ArcGIS Pro, and I will say it one more time, or ArcMap, where do those things sit, and can they be in the cloud? And yes, they can be in the cloud. The cloud providers are starting to offer options through their service technology to allow you to create instances in the cloud where you can virtualize these instances. You can use thin clients to access them. You can build environments to spec. So maybe you need to process a lot of 3D imagery one day, then do some caching the next. Maybe you need to do Pro, utility network, whatever it might be. You can actually leverage the cloud to help spin up an instance to support that workflow, and then turn it off when you're not using it anymore. So there's Amazon has things like workspace, app streaming. They have virtual workspaces. Azure has some similar technology to virtualize accessing Pro. Here you're seeing me, this little graphic on the right. I'm actually using ArcGIS Pro through a web browser using Amazon AppStream technology to execute Pro in the cloud. So now you could have Pro and the data sitting in the cloud at the same time, which can be pretty powerful.
So cool.
Yeah. So think about that as you move. So in some cases, you can lift your entire GIS department and put it into the cloud if needed. But again, just don't do it. You got to think this thing through, and we're going to talk about this in a second. How to envision the goals here, and then develop this plan to get you to your end game here and what's best for your environment. You may have a hybrid approach where you're doing some things back and forth there. But anyways, either way you do it, Esri does provide some deployment tools. So Esri has a tool called ArcGIS Enterprise Builder for on-premise sort of deployments, and then they have Enterprise Cloud Builder that can help you kind of walk you through deploying some of these instances. The two big cloud providers out there, Amazon and Microsoft, have these instances and these templates and these images that you can just pick up and deploy ArcGIS Enterprise out in the cloud. There's automation through things like Chef and other tools that you can use to help automate the process of deploying ArcGIS Enterprise. There's even calculators out there that you can kind of use to get a sense and do a cost estimation of what it's going to take to move things to the cloud. We have seen at GIS Inc a huge intake and folks moving to the cloud, especially over the last year. Our discussions have jumped exponentially, and our services to help support folks moving to the cloud has just been amazing. And people are seeing a huge benefit for moving to the cloud, which sort of takes us to our next polling question here, Kelly.
Alrighty. So, are you leveraging the cloud for ArcGIS Enterprise? Yes, with AWS. Yes, with Azure. Yes, other, such as Google or some hybrid. Not yet, or definitely not. If it's not yet, as in maybe you're interested and you're thinking about it and you could use some assistance helping to decide.
So while you do that, while we wait for that, there's 3 questions I want to answer real quickly. So one of those is, can I have enterprise geodatabase in my data store in a single entity or single instance? Yes, depending on your use case. Both those can run nicely on the same box. Do you see a performance degradation with using Pro in the cloud? You can, if you don't configure that right, so be careful how you do that. And then see Enterprise Evolve. So those builders that I just showed you, be careful deploying those, because some of those still only work on single instances. So again, you use these tools with a grain of salt and understand their purpose before you just go in and deploy those. All right, what do we got here, Kelly?
All right, so yeah, wow, we got a lot of folks that are not in the cloud.
Excellent, excellent. Now's the year for you. Take advantage of that. Look at opportunities to leverage the cloud and find ways, and reach out to some of those that you may know that are using, and kind of learn the pros and cons and the pain points. It's not the end all answer, right? But it does help fit the bill for some circumstances, and it does provide a lot of efficiencies and scalability and cost savings by going to the cloud. All right, let's move on.
All righty.
Now, these last couple of topics are going to get kind of deep here, and I don't want to get too technical, but I want to make sure we cover them because they all talk about how we manage our business continuity and maintain this availability to ArcGIS Enterprise, right? We're seeing a huge influx in people working from home, and providing that access to the enterprise through WebGIS, through remote desktop, virtualization, whatever it takes. We want to make sure that we can still maintain that high availability, or whatever the business continuity is within your organization. So let's take some time and walk through these slides carefully. So I want to make sure that some terminology is set before we move on. So to me, and this is my opinion, you might have some others. If you do, please post them. But high availability basically means what is the acceptable downtime that you as an organization can work against. Failover is really just a standby environment of some hardware and software that can be used to replace your production if needed to. Passive production is basically, in my mind, it's kind of built from failover, right? It's this inactive environment that's ready to be used and be activated if something goes down. And I highlighted this in orange because Esri provides a passive production licensing with your ArcGIS Enterprise licensing. So you can have a production environment and an active production and a passive production at the same time and not violate any licensing agreement. And then finally, disaster recovery. What happens when a truck drives through my data center? Or what happens when a catastrophe happens? How do I recover from that? So that's how I think about these terms. And when we think about these terms, we've got to think about how we apply this concept of business continuity across the board. Do we put in place some kind of backup and recovery processes to achieve my availability? Do we apply some kind of dual processes or dual systems in place to help achieve whatever that high availability is? Do we introduce geographic redundancy to provide again access to or try to maintain a high availability access to my environment? Or do I apply all of it together, right? Do I put high availability inside of each geographic redundant location, right? These are the kind of things you need to think about as you deploy and architect out your ArcGIS Enterprise environment. And I think it's important to understand this, the cost associated with achieving some level of business continuity, whether it's mission critical or business critical or significant or no impact at all. And the time it takes to recover, right, either from an outage from a system versus recovering from a point in time of data loss or an application deployment, things like that. And when you go from recovering or reducing that interruption from days down to seconds, the cost jumps up exponentially here because you're having to provide that infrastructure to achieve that. Okay, so let's kind of dive into this a little bit deeper in here. So again, what is the acceptable downtime for your business workflows? You know, that constitutes the high availability. That meets your business continuity threshold, mission, business, no impact, whatever. And when we have discussions with our customers talking about how to architect and deploy enterprise to achieve this, you got to start with some numbers, right? And here, if you just do the basic math and basic numbers, you can see, and you'll hear the context or the sentence, I need 3 nines of availability, or I need 4 nines of availability. What does that really mean? All right, so this kind of chart kind of indicates the acceptable downtime, non-scheduled downtime that meets these different availability time thresholds. So 99% availability means about an hour and a half downtime per week. So is that really needed, right, within your business continuity? And when we always start our discussions, we focus in on around the 95% availability range, because 8.5 hours a week, about an hour or so a day, is that workable? And I think you can achieve that with some of the out-of-the-box capabilities with enterprise and leveraging IT standards. A lot of the cloud providers provide a lot of redundancy and fault tolerance within their environment to begin with. And then you, on top of that, put in some processes and some procedures to help with controlling that access. And you can get to 95 pretty quickly. Is that enough? Again, that's all based on your business continuity outlook. But I think what's really critical here is that we tend to only think, in our space, we only think of ArcGIS Enterprise. I need to get ArcGIS Enterprise at a 95% availability. Well, you just can't think of that. You gotta think of the big picture and all the components that make up this environment that supports ArcGIS Enterprise. And that's obviously the components like the portal, the server, the data store. But what about your DNS server? What about your firewall, the switches, the data center, the power that's coming into the data center, the internet service provider, right? And I don't even have listed here the people that are associated with, the plans that are in place. All these things contribute to the overall availability of your site and how you calculate that availability. So for this slide and for this exercise, I want to just use these numbers, these common numbers here that you know, I set up my portal, my server, my data store. I'm getting basically those percentage of availability. I got some basic numbers there for some other components. If we just simply do the math here, right, and just do the math, all these components that look like they're pretty highly available on the left as a whole are only about 63.5% available. Because if one thing breaks or one thing goes down or one thing crashes, that interrupts everything else. So when you start thinking about calculating availability for your environment and making sure that your users get access, think of it holistically. You got to take more into consideration there. Okay, so you say, great. One of the heavy lifters here in this exercise is GIS server. All right, that's the workhorse. What if we put 2 servers out there, and we go from 90% availability for my server to 99 for that one component? How does that affect the overarching goal here? Still not pretty good, right? Still only 70% at best. What if we doubled everything except for the data center and ISP? We have no control over that. We doubled everything, put 2 of everything in place, again, except for the data center and ISP. We're still only about 90%. Again, my point is that you've got to look at everything holistically and don't just assume that your ISP, your data center, your switches, and your firewalls are all just going to work magically and that enterprise is going to be maintained, and or don't blame ArcGIS Enterprise for going down if some of these other things crashes, right? All right, so this is a fun chart I put together. I was just curious to see what it would take. So we got that first component at 63. We got 2 of everything except the data centers. What if I put 2 geographically located places together? 2 of everything plus a data center and another ISP. Hey, we finally reached 95% availability from the pure numbers perspective.
And is that 95% that 8 hours?
Yes, that 8 hours. That constitutes that 8 hours a week of unscheduled downtime. All right, now I get it. Before you guys start putting stuff in the chat over here, these are just numbers, right? Just calculations, just a few numbers to kind of set the stage here, because there's other things that go into play here. But this is what I wanted to kind of hone in on this slide, is that 95 is even 95% could be hard to do if you're not leveraging IT standard infrastructures. And the cloud provides that. A lot of you have access to good data centers on premise. Good for you, leverage those. But these are the things you got to consider. And one last note here, I'll point out. Great, so we've identified the availability of the environment, but we haven't even talked about loads yet, right? How many users are coming to your site? How often are they coming to the site? How big are these applications, the data that's getting pushed down over these networks? You also got to do the capacity planning around that. So there is some work that needs to happen before you just go deploy ArcGIS Enterprise and expect it to work and fulfill your needs without at least understanding the elements that affect this entire process. Okay, all right. So let's take this in mind and let's look at an example, and I'm going to use Amazon Web Services as an example of a typical deployment of ArcGIS Enterprise. This is how we may approach this, or you may approach this. And again, I'm using Amazon. This could be in your own data center. That's totally fine, totally acceptable. So here we're first establishing our Amazon account. We're setting up access control procedures in there so we can control access to that through security mechanisms. We're picking a region that we want to work in. We're picking an availability zone within that region. We're defining a virtual private cloud or network that we can isolate our components within different subnets. Some subnets can be public, some private, depending on how we isolate these things. We typically like to put in a gateway and a load balancer to kind of help with securing ports and accessing those ports, and introducing some protection at that level for like SQL injection and things like that. We always typically like to put in a network address translator to kind of, again, have another level of security. We have our web adapter, our remote desktop gateway, so we can log in and manage the infrastructure. That usually sits in our public subnet where we control that. And then we isolate the other components like the portal, the server, the data store. But then you can extend this, right, to the additional server roles that you need out there. And this constitutes our active production environment. This fulfills the license agreement that you have for Esri. But Esri also offers the ability for you to set up a passive production environment. So maybe you put that global load balancer out front where you can manage the communication between your active environment. And then when it's time to do maintenance and work on your active, you can switch roles, activate your passive environment, deactivate your active, and you can stay in sync. Now, there's some procedures that have to be happening in the background to make sure data and applications and things like that are updated. But this is an acceptable and a very viable way of leveraging your license with Esri, as well as providing a very reactive environment for publishing and serving out your solutions to your users. This also illustrates the concept of a benefit of the cloud, meaning that passive production environment could be turned off and not occurring cost until I need it, right? Until I actually have to use it. And so that's a little bit different than in a data center where I've already procured all this hardware that's sitting there waiting to be used, but I've already bought it, but I'm not really using it yet. The cloud offers this scalability of cost benefit. Okay.
So from a cloud cost perspective, there's 2 aspects here. Not just cloud, it's also Esri licensing. If you use this passive approach, you don't require the licensing to support 2 active environments.
Exactly.
But you still can have the benefit of availability.
Right, so that comes into that failover or that active passive role, but also it puts you in a position to where maybe one day you have reached that capacity where you need additional servers. Well, now I just turn those both to active production. I acquire my other licensing, it's already in place. I open up my load balancer to hit both sides, and we'll move on like that, okay? All right, so a good question just popped in. I think it'd be good to answer right now. How many ArcGIS servers would be required in this? So right now, I'm only talking about a 4-core licensing. So one ArcGIS server, one 4-core licensing in my active, and one 4-core licensing in my production. And that would constitute and support the license agreement with Azure. All right. So let's move on to security. Security guidelines and best practices. Now, this is always a big discussion, a big topic about how we handle and work through this process. So let's start off with this concept of a shared model between different organizations when we all talk about securing ArcGIS Enterprise, and that is whatever data center you're using, whether it's on-prem or it's in the cloud, that data center and the administrator of that data center or that cloud provider is responsible for security of that center or of that cloud space, okay? Then the administrator of ArcGIS Enterprise and that space, they're going to be responsible for security in that center for that environment. So you have the data center responsible for security of the center, administrative security responsible for security in the center for those environments. Then you have the organization itself that needs to be involved with setting up the security controls and defining what makes up the security requirements for accessing information, for disseminating that information, for providing access to certain users. All that has to be a discussion between all 3 entities and determined before you go forward and before you move forward. It's best to kind of define the security plan as much as you can up front, because some of these security measures might be a little more difficult to put in place afterwards. Maybe things like encryption, data encryption at rest or in transit and things like that. We're going to make sure we have some of that in play up front there. So I talked about an example with Amazon. Let's look at an example with Microsoft Azure. Again, we're going to focus in on just the 4 main components of ArcGIS Enterprise. The web server, which might have your web adapters, your app server, which have portal, the GIS server that has ArcGIS server on it, and the data store with your relational and or tile services. That's the base. Again, we could extend this to other server roles and things like that, but let's focus on this for our discussion. So the first thing you would do inside of Azure is set up your organization account, which is where you set up those access control policies and you define what region you want to have access. That's your first level of defense there. And then if you need to provide another level, Azure and Google and Amazon, they all provide this thing called a GovCloud region, which basically says, you know, if you need this kind of security, it basically says that these are regions that only are facilitated within the United States, and only U.S. federal, state, local, tribal organizations can have access and use that and manage that environment. There's some registration and some validation and verification you have to go through. There's some more to it, but in GIST, you could set up a level of security at this level. You don't have to, because there's some other security mechanisms you can provide, but if this is a requirement, that is available to you. The next level is that Azure provides this resource group that allows you to then further control what users have access and what services are allowed to run inside of this environment. And then you set up this virtual private cloud, or this VNet, as Azure calls it, where you set up your network security groups. If you're going to use managed service accounts and Active Directory, you can do that here. This is where you configure your certificate, your asserts, like your SSL and TLS certs, where you open and manage your firewalls and access. If you need integrated Windows authentication, this is where that kind of takes place there. And then you have this environment set up, and then you start to put the pieces together. Now, what we found through our deployment processes over the years is that And again, all cloud providers provide this process, but for Azure, they provide this thing called an app gateway, which brings together two very important services. It's what they call a level 7 load balancer and a web application firewall, which together allows me to put in place these protection mechanisms and monitors to allow me to make sure that I'm not getting that denial of service attacks or the SQL injection attacks, or I've configured my environment correctly, looking for bot mitigation, crawler scanners, whatever else. And there's a whole list of things that you can configure in order to help control who and what is coming into your environment. And if you choose to use this app gateway, then in some cases you don't need that web server because the application gateway handles all that for you. So if you don't need integrated Windows authentication within your portal environment, then you might not need the web adapters at all. So there's some cost savings there without having to spin up a web server. So that constitutes sort of this public subnet, similar to how we had it configured in Amazon. Azure supports that, and then you basically privatize the rest of the components there in their own subnets, only open up and exposing the ports that need to communicate to portal and out through the application gateway, out to your applications and to your environment there. So there's a really nice evolution that you can go through to provide security. And we're just talking about the infrastructure right now. We haven't gotten into the components of ArcGIS Enterprise. This is just getting the environment ready. And both Microsoft, Amazon, and Google all have these levels of security that you can take advantage of. Okay, so now we're at this level. Let's dive deeper into server and to portal specifically, because there's some security protocols you can put in place for that environment. So we'll start off with server. So things you want to think about. Enabling and using HTTPS only. I think at 8, that's default, and moving forward, it's going to be a default setting, so you don't want to change that. You can disable access to the service directory. You can restrict cross-domain requests. Basically, that says if you're building JavaScript-based applications and I got to communicate to several services, I want to make sure everything has the right security in it before they communicate to each other, right? I can restrict that kind of cross-domain request without having the proper security in place. I can disable that primary service account. You can set up how you manage feature layer security and editing. Do I expose things out to the internet, to the public, or to my users to edit? Does that open up risks for how people interact with my information there? You can set up those protocols. There's Esri provides a server scan script. It's basically a Python script that you can run against your environment to do some basic checks to make sure if there's any holes within your environment. So I put these two in orange, to enable HTTPS and server scan. Those things I think you should, that's a must. These other things have to be discussed, right? Do I want to disable services directly access? Do I want to restrict cross-domain? Those things are optional. They still need to be considered, and you should consider that, but the ones in orange definitely maintain that. But the server scan script is very useful, and there's this security advisory tool. As we released this a while back, when they made the announcement that ArcGIS Online is only going HTTPS and they're only going to support HTTPS protocols moving forward. They've also provided this tool where you can use it online to connect either to your ArcGIS Online or your ArcGIS Enterprise to, again, do a quick scan and make sure you meet some certain level of security. But this server scan script, I want to show you this real quick. These are some of the items that this script goes through to check to see if, yeah, are you using HTTPS? Are you using standard queries, and are they enforced? Are you generating tokens when you're getting and posting information? All right, all these different security checks that scan script goes through, gives you a nice report, and then you can mitigate and react based on your requirements of that environment there. So ArcGIS Server has its set of things that you can use and do to further support security and take advantage of that. Portal has some of the similar ones, but also adds some additional ones. So again, enforce HTTPS communication only, disable that ArcGIS portal directory, right? Sharing the API access to that environment, restrict proxy services and access to that. So basically, by default, Portal has built in this sort of this unrestricted proxy protocol where you can actually store credentials inside services, especially if you're accessing online premium services or other secured services. You want to be careful with that, because then that stored security protocols then go with that those requests. And so there's options for restricting those proxies. Again, disabling that option to create an account automatically. I obviously just disable that. Again, same thing here with the restricting the domain access. Monitoring what servers you trust within your environment. So Portal gives you the ability to trust these other services and federate servers and access other components and other organizations implementations of Portal and server. And so you can assign what servers are trusted within your organization there. How you handle your sharing policies, especially if you're going to go to the public. Now, public means two things here: public to your organization and public to the world. And you handle those two things differently. And then obviously they, as we also provide a similar script for scanning your Portal implementations, and also don't forget that security advisory tool. So the differences between that script are here for Portal. There's things that are important here that you might want to consider. Things like, how am I managing my identity store when I'm creating users and accounts? Am I using built-in? Am I using some kind of LDAP identity store? Am I using anonymous access? Am I using self-signed certificates? Am I using token-based? Again, all these elements to help further secure your environment. You want to make sure, if you're doing this yourself, run these scans periodically, so that you can keep track of this. Or if someone else is doing this for you, demand that they run these and give you a report so that you can see and audit your environment there. Now, one thing that we sort of haven't talked about, sort of a bonus question here, is that we've got ArcGIS Enterprise. We've architected out our environment. We've talked through the security and deployment, high availability schema. We've defined this awesome environment. We've deployed everything. We've got everything up and running. How do we monitor it? How do we make sure that it's healthy, that it's running, and that it's doing its job, right? So Kelly's going to walk us through some concepts about monitoring ArcGIS in its environment.
Yeah, so in order to monitor various aspects of ArcGIS Enterprise, there's a variety of options. So you can just utilize what's available through the cloud infrastructure that's provided just to monitor the servers themselves. Then there's GIS Inc, which has a solution incorporating more than just the infrastructure. Right now we're getting into some nice graphics, etc., and even getting involved into some of the services that are up and running, some that aren't, what we might need to address from our GIS servers perspective. And Esri has ArcGIS Monitor, which also has this more granular detail about all the different infrastructure that you have, that you're wanting to keep up, all the different services, what's going on there. And then there's even a third-party option, PRTG, which, also same kind of thing, lots of different options, different views. You got lots of different ways that you can consider.
Yeah, and I think picking one that works best for you is important. Typically, like Kelly mentioned, the cloud provider or your IT department should provide some basic monitoring for CPU, RAM, storage, bandwidth, those kinds of things. But what's always left out is the services, right? Is my map services up and running? Is my application accessible? Those kinds of things. And that's where some scripts that we've written can handle that. ArcGIS Monitor definitely can handle all that, and plus it can handle the holistically view of your entire platform. And then this PRTG we found to be pretty useful. One, because it's free for the first 100 connections, and for most default deployments, of enterprise will fall within about 50 connections. And then you can add on top of that some services and applications and stuff. So a really nice tool there. And if you want to learn more about that, hit gisinc.com/blog. We had one of our internal solution engineers write a nice blog about all of these capabilities and when and where you might want to use one or the other. Okay, so let's summarize what we talked about here, because I want to get to some of these questions. We've got tons of questions to go through. We talked about ArcGIS Enterprise as a whole, right? Its capabilities of web enabling our data, implementing maps, assigning applications, sharing information, securing, leveraging the solutions and templates. It's like this holistic view of how our enterprise can work within your organization. We talked about a lot of the enhancements at the current release, from administration all the way down to the new user type extensions with some neat tools in between there. Remember that 9.0 is coming out any day now, and then 9.1 will be out later this year. We looked at some best practices for architecting and deploying ArcGIS Enterprise. I think the key that I want to highlight there again is that ArcGIS Enterprise can run very nicely on a single machine. Everything, the portal, the web adapter, server, and data store. Again, depending on the size of your organization and the number of users that are hitting it and the type of data, those kinds of things, we have very successful clients that have been running ArcGIS Enterprise for years off of one server because it fits their workflow. But we also have very complex deployments of ArcGIS Enterprise with 30 or more machines because of the distribution of their users, the number of their users, the type of applications they're doing. So again, and I think that's the beauty of Enterprise, is that it can scale to the need of your organization. And then we focused a lot on high availability and security. And I think that's, again, an area that, if I would make any suggestion here, is you spend some time up front going through that discussion and making that plan first, so it can save you some headache on the back end, save you some the possibility of having to redo things or redeploy things, or you didn't start off high enough at the first place, especially if you're doing this on-prem and you have to procure this set amount of hardware right up front, and that's supposed to fulfill your needs for the next 3 years or 5 years. Make sure you do that planning up front. If you're on the cloud, you have some leeway. You can spin things up and turn things down very quickly, and that's one of the areas where, again, I like the cloud. And maybe there's a hybrid approach here where you can use the cloud to do some just test the waters with, stand up one instance, deploy the ArcGIS Enterprise environment, test out the access and security controls, and then turn it off when you're not using it. Right, the cloud gives that flexibility to take advantage of those services. And then apply security. Do not forget security. The basics are right there. We talked about the basics. At least, if anything, deploy the basics and then tack onto that as needed from that point on. So I'm gonna leave this slide up right here. If you have any further questions beyond this, obviously email Kelly and myself. Go to gisinc.com to get started talking to somebody there. We got lots of questions. If we don't get to all of these questions right now, we will answer them in a blog post. But Kelly, why don't you take us for the next 5 or so minutes, and let's talk about some of these.
Yeah, absolutely. So since security was hot topic, there's a few questions just quickly. Where again do we find the scripts for the server scan?
Yes, so both portal and server, under the installation folders, there's going to be a tools. So you go under the ArcGIS installation folder, look for tools. Inside there, there's going to be server, this scan Python scripts out there. And if you can't find it, just Google ArcGIS server scan script or scan tool, and it'll lead you right to it. And it'll be a nice help document on how to use it, the results, examples, and things like that.
And is this different from the Esri Security Advisor?
Yes, it is. So, Security Advisor looks at it sort of at a higher level, some of the basic things that Esri has been talking about for years, about make sure you supply a certificate, make sure you use HTTPS. So there'll be a basic things there, and it'll look at the services within your environment. So if you run that against your ArcGIS Online per se, it might show you a list of items in there that are either not using HTTPS or are accessing, maybe have a web map that's accessing an HTTP, a non-HTTPS service. So that online tool gives you a little bit different information than what the scan tool. The scan tool looks at specific configurations for your deployment of either server or portal.
Excellent.
Steve,
All right, so what, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Kelly, sorry.
Okay.
So Steve, I have a quick question, and it was one of the first questions I was asked. Can you take a couple of minutes and describe branch versioning, how it's implemented, and what it's really doing? Because this one especially deals with parcel fabric and utility management. So,
yeah. So branch versioning is the new, I would say, control mechanisms for allowing multiple people to edit the information. Now, if you've done any multi-user editing inside of Enterprise View Database, you remember that process enables one or more person to come in and edit the information, and you can sort of divvy up access to different versions of that information. So you can have a default version, and you can set up an editor 1 and editor 2, and I can edit those information, and all that's sort of handled within the relational database environment, as well as within the ArcMap or ArcGIS Pro construct. Branch versioning is taking that sort of same concept, but moving it over into a service-oriented approach, meaning that the REST endpoints and the services that manage that access to those environments control who's editing, when they're editing, and how I can post and reconcile and access that information. So it's at the core level, it's how Esri is managing that has changed, and which affects how we deploy that to our end user. Now, Frank, you may have some more to provide to that, but it fundamentally has changed because we're going to this service-oriented architecture approach. So that managing that version had to change as well.
right. So also, it's my understanding that unlike SDE versioning, there are no excessive tables. There's no add and delete tables. It's added within the geodatabase, but rather it is all within the same stream of data, but it's time-stamped. And it's so not only can you go and look at a specific version, but you can actually roll back to a specific point in time, because it is stamped specifically when an edit is made and when it becomes active, so that it is very different the way versioning is managed inside of REST services and web services than inside of SDE.
Right, you're exactly right, which is why it's taken some time to help to kind of push that protocol down to all the other applications like Collector and other tools, right? That whole process there. But
right. Thank you.
You're right. Yeah, thank you, Frank. What else, Kelly?
Awesome. So what is the fastest process for replicating AGL web maps and dashboards, etc., onto enterprise platform? Or is rebuilding the web maps and dashboards the best route, which takes more time?
Right. So this whole migration, if you're moving from online to enterprise, or even going from enterprise on-premise to enterprise in cloud, how do you manage and move your content? And this is always a bigger discussion, but let me just kind of bring out two points here. One is that I always recommend that this is a perfect time to do some spring cleaning. Just don't, if you're doing this migration, take the time to look at your environment and see what you can clean up, because inevitably, when you started using ArcGIS Online, it was just like a free-for-all. Or you started using ArcGIS Enterprise, it was a free-for-all. And everybody's got their maps and apps and data, and it's just grown to this mammoth thing. So take the time to clean things up and move things over that affect your overall workflow. Now, Esri has seen this problem, this challenge of doing migration. So starting at 10.9, they're going to include some tools for assisting in that migration process. So look for that. There's also the REST API exposes all these things already. So if you didn't have some out-of-the-box tools to do this for you already, Python can help that. We've had to do a lot of migration, so we've written some Python scripts to help migrate those things from one environment to the other environment. Another one is one of our business partners called GeoJob. They provide a really nice tool to connect portal in your enterprise or portal to portal and do bulk migrations of items and groups and users and everything. So there's several options out there. GeoJob has their tool. I think it's called the administrator or something like that you can use to migrate. There's some tools coming with the 9.0 release and 9.1, and then there's access to the root Python scripts that you can write your own and customize that process. But,
so it ties into what is a good way to back up ArcGIS Online?
That's a great question. Great question. And I always say, and I don't usually use that term "great question" a lot because I don't want to insinuate that no one else has a great question, but that has been a challenge. That's been a challenge from the very beginning of ArcGIS Online. How do we back up ArcGIS Online? So Esri provides their own SLA with ArcGIS Online, meaning that it's uptime, its availability, and its redundancy, things like that. So it helps ease the mindset that things are going to be, they have their own mechanisms in place. The best answer I can give, and Kelly, maybe you can help us out, is that script this through Python, for one. GeoJob has some tools for exporting this stuff out with, or, well, I guess that's really it. Python scripts and/or use a third-party tool right now. That's what I've got for that one.
Of course, a script could be, I mean, Python's convenient, but of course it could really be any language you wanted, and you're directly communicating with ArcGIS server in some fashion.
Yeah. Yeah, and Python, I mean, and ArcGIS Online gets a little bit tricky when you start getting really large hosted feature services. You might have to do that in chunks of data. So you can write your Python script to get, a gig of data, then another gig and another gig, and kind of cycle that down to get everything down from a data perspective.
Yeah, definitely. The larger the content mass that you have, the more challenging this becomes. Okay, have you seen any customers try to configure a highly available geo event server environment? In previous versions of the software, it's been difficult to ensure high availability for geo events. Any recommendations on a specific approach for this?
Yes, without getting into the detail, basically, what I've done this in the past is I set up an independent geo event server. So, and I think we've done up to about 3 sort of our mask part of that. But on top of that, you have to put your load balancer, your Kafka interrogator, or some kind of overarching tool that communicates to all 3 of those. So the max is about 3, I think, to fulfill a sort of high availability geo event, but you got to have something on top of that to communicate, and usually that's either a Kafka Zookeeper, I think that is what they call it, and or some kind of load balancer in play there.
Cool. Can your enterprise geodatabase and ArcGIS data store database be a singular entity?
Yeah, I think I answered that during the question when I saw that come in. So yes, that is a definite. You can, but again, based on your requirements, if you got hundreds and thousands of users hitting the enterprise geodatabase, and you maybe don't want that to also affect your data store. But you definitely can. Again, look at your requirements, look at your user base, and see if that fits.
And Steve, one more thing on that, because I saw another question in here. If you've got them all on one single geodatabase, that doesn't mean that all connections to that geodatabase are going to be branch versioning. You can still have traditional SDE versioning connections to that, and you can also have branch versioning connections to it, correct?
Yes, exactly. Your enterprise database can support that parcel fabric, that utility network fabric, that your traditional feature classes and feature serving, all that stuff, definitely.
Good,
And
thank you.
then the data store manages all your hosted feature services, and both those can reside on the same machine, or you can push them off as needed.
Thanks.
The
Yep.
dedicated shared instance concept is interesting. If you have it, can you provide info or guidance on when to use shared versus dedicated?
So share instances, again, we're talking about ArcGIS Server again. When you fire up that instance, you have an option to say, dedicate this instance so that only my applications and the users that come here are focused and positioned directly with that. Shared allows me to have multiple map services that may not be used a whole lot. Maybe they're base maps or your topographic layers. They're just used for reference layers. You know, they're not your editing layers. They're not things that are hit, you know, constantly. These things are just there running to help support reference, support the context of your application. I think of those as all shared, right? You shouldn't have a separate SOC instance for each one of those. Move those into one instance, one shared instance, and then dedicate the others for very specific workflows, editing processes, or things that are in high demand.
Steve, I've got another question. John Bell just asked a question and said, what are the impacts of automating reconcile and post-processing through a geoprocessing service in a branch versioning environment?
You know, I'm going to have to play dumb on this. I do not know. But we will find out for sure about that.
I do know there were some issues regarding reconciling and posting of large edits, long transactions. However, that's been fixed with the latest patch, but I'm not sure whether there's any implications for actually doing it rec and post with a geoprocessing service.
Service instead of, yeah. I don't know, Frank. Let's dig into that, and we'll email that.
Yeah, good question, John.
When do you know it's time to migrate from a desktop and AGOL setup to an enterprise setup?
I guess a couple things there. Maybe your licensing and your need for named user accounts have reached a threshold to where it's cost benefit to move from one environment to another. Maybe the security or the deployment or the scalability control would take you from, because remember, ArcGIS Online, Esri maintains the updating of the software, maintains the SLA, maintains the security. So if you need to have any more control over that, then that would be a reason to go enterprise. Another big one is maybe you have third-party applications that run on a certain version of enterprise that require that. That would be another reason to keep and run enterprise instead of an ArcGIS Online. But just because you move to enterprise still gives you access to online. That's part of your license agreement, and you can have a hybrid approach. And a lot of our folks do that, meaning that they have sort of their public to the world services on ArcGIS Online, because Esri manages that infrastructure very nicely, and then organizational services and solutions in ArcGIS Enterprise, where you can control that tighter, and the security and Active Directory and LDAP, all those kinds of things. So there's probably several reasons.
Yeah, any other use cases for that hybrid AGOL and enterprise?
So public would definitely be one. Well, think about this, and as we're starting to release things like ArcGIS Velocity, right, which allows us to do high-end IoT and streaming services, that might be a reason to implement and keep ArcGIS Online for that, and just use enterprise instead of having to set up and have a hybrid geo event and manage all that infrastructure. Use that. Hub, urban. There's several other things out there that that could lead me to have a hybrid approach, but public is always a big one. Or maybe you have outside contractors that you don't want them having access to your enterprise. You can post and publish services to an ArcGIS Online and give them access to that environment.
Let's see.
Well, actually, we got about 60 seconds left. Let's kind of wrap this up. We'll answer all your questions. through email, and let's kind of close it up and turn it over to Shannon to kind of set the stage here.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, that was excellent. Thank you so much for your participation all in the polling questions and in the survey. We're going to splash on the screen for you just a quick 4 questions. We appreciate your input. Thanks for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah, bye. Kelly. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks for attending, and we hope you enjoyed this workshop. If you have questions, would like some more details about anything we discussed during this workshop, or if you or anyone at your organization would like information about training, support, or ways in which we can help you with your GIS needs, please contact me at frank@pandaconsulting.com or call me at 561-691-3277, and we can discuss how we can help you with your needs.